On December 24th, 2019, at a home in Muncie, Indiana, the Maness family gathered to celebrate Christmas. Amid the warm atmosphere of the holiday, 4-year-old Hayden Maness, with his bright eyes and wide smile, eagerly unwrapped gifts under the watchful eyes of his relatives. It was the last time the family would see Hayden joyfully by their side. A child with no obvious enemies, living in what seemed to be a peaceful family, vanishing suddenly under circumstances that defy explanation. And from that moment, no one saw him again. What really happened to Hayden Maness? Hayden Ian Lee Maness was born on May 15, 2015, into a family marked by instability and struggle. His father, Dustin Maness, had long been caught in the grips of addiction, battling both substance abuse and the consequences of his actions. Dustin's life was tumultuous, often overshadowed by poor decisions and the constant cycle of addiction. Despite this, there were moments when Dustin showed tenderness toward his son. When sober, he would express love for Hayden, attempting to be the father he couldn't always be. But these moments were fleeting, lost in the chaos that plagued Dustin's life. Hayden's mother, Terry Williams, had her own troubled past. Like Dustin, she had been involved in criminal activities and struggled with drug addiction. Their relationship, strained by their individual issues, left Hayden vulnerable in his early years. In 2016, when Hayden was only 1 year old, the authorities stepped in. Dustin and Terry had been caught using cocaine, and it became clear that they were unfit to care for their child. Hayden was removed from their custody, placed into the care of his grandfather, Gary Maness. Gary Maness, while not a perfect man, offered Hayden a stable and loving environment. He was a quiet, dependable figure in Hayden's life, and the two formed a bond that was deep and genuine. Gary's home became Hayden's sanctuary, a place where he could feel safe and cared for. During those early years, Hayden was not just a grandson to Gary, he was a constant companion. Gary would often find Hayden by his side, helping him with chores around the house, or simply following him wherever he went. This was the most stable time in Hayden's short life, and for a while, it seemed like the chaos of his parents' struggles had receded into the background. However, the peace would not last. In 2018, after completing a court-ordered rehabilitation program, Dustin regained custody of Hayden. Despite Gary's plea to keep his grandson, the court ruled in favor of Dustin, allowing him to take Hayden back into his care. This decision marked a turning point for the young boy. It wasn't just the loss of his grandfather's steady presence, it was the return to a life filled with uncertainty and instability. The following year, Hayden lived with his father, but the family saw less and less of them. The visits from Dustin and Hayden, which had been frequent in the beginning, became increasingly rare. In May of 2019, Dustin's mother, Leanna, passed away. Her death was a significant blow to Dustin, and it seemed to affect him deeply. Some family members speculated that this loss contributed to his struggles with addiction and emotional instability, which in turn affected his relationship with Hayden. As the months passed, family members noticed the growing distance between them and Dustin. What had once been regular visits soon became occasional ones, and eventually, they stopped altogether. On Christmas Eve of 2019, Hayden attended the family gathering at his great-grandmother's house in Muncie, Indiana. It was a typical holiday evening. The family came together to exchange gifts, share a meal, and enjoy each other's company. Hayden, full of excitement, ran around the house, opening presents and playing with his relatives. For those brief moments, everything seemed normal. The joy of the holiday season filled the room, and Hayden's laughter echoed through the house. It was a scene of warmth and love, a memory that the family would hold on to dearly. But that night marked the last time anyone in the family saw Hayden. After that Christmas gathering, Contact with Dustin and Hayden ceased completely. Messages sent to Dustin went unanswered. Phone calls were ignored. The family tried reaching out, sending invitations for family events, but there was no response. The communication stopped, and with it, the uncertainty began to grow. The last person to see Hayden was his grandfather, Gary Manis. Gary recalled the events of that night with clarity, remembering how Hayden had been so full of life and energy, running around and enjoying the holiday. It was the last image Gary would hold in his heart, a smiling, happy boy surrounded by family. But after Christmas 2019, that image would fade into a painful silence. From that moment on, no one heard from Hayden or Dustin again. The family's efforts to contact them were fruitless. They left messages, sent texts, and tried calling. But nothing. The silence grew louder with each passing day. Family members were left to wonder what had happened, as weeks turned into months. The mystery of Hayden's disappearance remained unsolved. And as time went on, the questions only became more pressing. Where was Hayden? Why had he suddenly disappeared without a trace? The last traces of Hayden's presence faded into the void. And from that point on, the family's search for answers would begin. But no one could have anticipated just how long it would take to uncover the truth. The investigation into Hayden Manis's disappearance began shortly after the family realized that the silence surrounding him was no longer just concerning. It was deeply troubling. For weeks after Christmas 2019, the family tried to reach out to Dustin, but their calls and messages went unanswered. It was unusual for him to completely cut off communication, especially with his family, who had always tried to support him, despite his struggles. Something was clearly wrong. In the weeks following the disappearance, the family's worries grew more intense. At first, they thought perhaps Dustin and Hayden were simply going through a rough patch, or maybe they had moved away. But when the usual holiday communication failed to materialize, the family became desperate for answers. They started contacting other relatives, friends, and neighbors, hoping to find some clue as to Hayden's whereabouts. Eventually, the family reached out to the local police. The Muncie Police Department was the first to take on the case, initiating a formal inquiry into Hayden's sudden disappearance. The authorities began by interviewing family members, friends, and anyone who might have seen Hayden or Dustin in the weeks following Christmas 2019. The lack of solid leads, however, made the investigation challenging. As part of the investigation, the Department of Child Services, DCS, was also brought into the case, given Hayden's previous history with the agency. DCS was tasked with tracking any potential involvement in Hayden's case, especially in light of the fact that Dustin had a history of addiction and had previously lost custody of Hayden. It was also noted that, as far as the family knew, there was no record of Hayden being enrolled in any school or daycare since his last known appearance in 2019. The police investigation initially focused on verifying whether Hayden had been placed in any kind of child protective custody. They reached out to DCS, who confirmed that there were no new custody cases or records involving Hayden since he had been returned to Dustin in 2018. This raised the first red flag. If Hayden had indeed been taken into care, it wasn't recorded, and there was no sign of him having attended school or daycare, which would have been expected for a child of his age. The more the family and the authorities dug into Dustin's life, the more it became clear that something was amiss. Dustin's actions, or rather, his lack of action, added to the growing suspicion. Family members, who had always been in touch with him, now struggled to reach him. His usual patterns of communication had changed. Messages were sent, but the responses were slow or non-existent. At one point, a relative reached out to him via text, asking about Hayden's whereabouts, and Dustin simply replied, "I'm fine, don't worry, everything's good." But this response felt off. Family members felt that Dustin, who had always been somewhat open with them, was deliberately shutting them out. They found it odd that he would cut off communication so completely, especially with the pressure of a missing child on his shoulders. More troubling was the lack of any visible efforts from Dustin to explain Hayden's absence. Normally, a parent who was struggling might still reach out, seeking help or advice, but Dustin remained distant. In addition to this, rumors began to swirl. People in the Aur community, including neighbors, began to talk. There were whispers about Dustin's living situation. Some claimed to have seen him with a woman, but no one had seen Hayden. A few neighbors even mentioned that they had seen 2 girls in Dustin's home, but there was no sign of Hayden. This created even more uncertainty about where the child might be, and whether there was something more sinister behind his disappearance. As the investigation progressed, the police took the first formal step of searching Dustin's home. They scoured the property, looking for any evidence of Hayden or signs of a struggle. They even brought in cadaver dogs to assist in the search, though no evidence of foul play was found at that time. The absence of Hayden was even more baffling, considering the lack of any signs that would typically accompany a missing child's case. No signs of forced entry or other obvious indications of abduction. It appeared as though the child had simply vanished without a trace. At the same time, the family began to grow increasingly worried. Their fear was palpable, especially given the complete lack of information. They had been waiting for answers, but with each passing day, their hope was dwindling. Their emotions ranged from confusion to anger, but what remained constant was their deep concern for Hayden. They couldn't understand why Dustin would vanish with his son, and why he had not contacted anyone to explain or to assure them that Hayden was all right. The lack of contact with the extended family, who had always been a support system for Dustin, felt like an intentional attempt to distance himself. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the police were not receiving the cooperation they had hoped for from Dustin. While there was still no clear evidence to point directly to him, his silence and refusal to engage in the investigation made him an increasingly suspicious figure. His unwillingness to allow the authorities or family to check on Hayden added to the growing list of odd behaviors that painted a troubling picture. Family members, especially Hayden's grandfather Gary, became more frustrated with Dustin's evasive actions. They could not understand why he wouldn't simply come forward with information about Hayden. It felt like he was hiding something. The longer Dustin remained silent, the more the family began to question not only his role in Hayden's disappearance, but also his ability to care for him in the first place. As time passed, the case began to take a toll on the family. The strain of not knowing Hayden's whereabouts, coupled with Dustin's refusal to help, created an emotional divide. The more they learned about Dustin's behavior, the more they questioned whether Hayden was still alive, or if something far worse had happened to him. After the initial flurry of investigation and hope, the case of Hayden Manis seemed to fade into the background. The months turned into years, and with each passing day, the possibility of finding Hayden alive seemed to slip further away. Despite the police's continued efforts, there was no new information, and the search grew cold. The family's calls, texts, and letters to Dustin went unanswered, leaving them in an agonizing state of uncertainty. As 2020 came and went, the pandemic swept across the country, altering the way the world operated. The lockdowns and social distancing measures meant that even the most basic forms of communication became strained. The family, though worried and heartbroken, had no new leads to follow. The holidays came and went without any sign of Hayden, and the once vibrant hope for his return slowly withered into a quiet, aching sorrow. Dustin's absence from the family's life became even more pronounced as he moved away from Muncie in 2021. The family had always hoped for some kind of breakthrough, perhaps a phone call, a message, or even a direct meeting. But as the months passed and Dustin remained unreachable, that hope dimmed. His responses when they came were vague at best, and the family's requests for information about Hayden were continually ignored. For those close to the case, the silence was deafening. Family members would occasionally gather, hoping for some form of resolution or a glimpse of truth. But each time they reached out to Dustin, he would offer the same empty reassurances, nothing to suggest he was in contact with Hayden or had any knowledge of his whereabouts. The family began to feel as though they were being shut out, not just by Dustin, but by the world at large. The investigation, once a beacon of hope, had become a distant memory, overshadowed by other cases and the demands of everyday life. In 2023, the case, which had gone cold and unspoken for years, took an unexpected turn. Dustin sent a message to a family member, one of the few times he had communicated with the family in recent months. The message was cryptic, full of promises and reassurances that everything was fine, but it didn't answer the most pressing question. What had happened to Hayden? In it, Dustin spoke about his life, his family, and his plans, but there was no mention of his son. The lack of any direct reference to Hayden was telling. It was as though he had simply been erased from Dustin's life. Despite this message, the family's anxiety only grew. The absence of Hayden was becoming more than just a missing child case. It was a painful riddle, with no resolution in sight. As they looked back at the sparse details, they began to wonder if Dustin was hiding something. The lack of a clear explanation, combined with his ongoing silence, only deepened the mystery. It was clear that Dustin was not cooperating, and this created a growing sense of distrust within the family. His behavior, once seen as part of the struggles with addiction, now appeared to be a deliberate act of evasion. The family, however, refused to let go of the hope that Hayden was out, there somewhere, alive, and that one day they would know what had truly happened to him. Gary, Hayden's grandfather, continued to believe that his grandson was somewhere, that he had to be. His memories of that last Christmas, seeing Hayden's face light up with excitement, were all he had left. But the passage of time began to chip away at that hope. He was growing older, and the years without answers weighed heavily on him. As the investigation into Hayden's disappearance grew colder, the family tried to keep the case alive in their hearts. They would occasionally reach out to the police, asking for updates, only to be told that there was little new to report. The lack of progress became a source of frustration and hopelessness. The case seemed to be trapped in a never-ending loop of uncertainty, with no closure in sight. It wasn't until the fall of 2024 that a new clue emerged, one that would break the long silence and reopen the investigation. This time, the breakthrough didn't come from the family or the police, but from a chance encounter between two of Hayden's great-grandmothers in a store in Muncie. They had not seen each other in some time, but during their conversation, one of the grandmothers mentioned something that would reignite the case. She recalled a conversation she had with Dustin in 2022, when he told her that Hayden had been taken away by DCS again, this time in 2022. This was an alarming statement, considering that the family had never heard of such an event. When the family contacted DCS, they were told that no such records existed. There was no indication that Hayden had been removed from Dustin's care, and there were no new custody proceedings. This revelation threw the case into turmoil once again. If Dustin had lied about Hayden being taken by DCS, what else had he been hiding? What had really happened to Hayden? This was the turning point in the investigation. It was as though the case had been revived from the dead, and the family's suspicions about Dustin grew stronger. The police quickly reopened the investigation, reaching out to Dustin once more. His refusal to cooperate, coupled with the new information from DCS, raised new questions that needed answering. But the investigation would not be an easy one. As the family and law enforcement pushed forward, They found themselves confronting an overwhelming silence from Dustin. His evasions and lies only made the case more complex, and the question of what happened to Hayden was as far from being answered as it had ever been. The family was no closer to finding Hayden than they had been when the search began, but the reopening of the case brought a new determination to find the truth. It wasn't over yet. As the investigation reopened in 2024, the family's hopes were once again ignited. The mysterious statements from Dustin, particularly his claim that Hayden had been taken by the Department of Child Services, DCS, in 2022, added an unexpected twist to the case. For years, there had been no mention of such an event, and the family was stunned by the revelation. They had always assumed that Hayden was living with Dustin, albeit in an increasingly isolated environment. But if Hayden had been taken into custody again, why had no one known about it? The first step in the renewed investigation was to verify Dustin's claim. Authorities contacted DCS, hoping to uncover any records or documents that could confirm his story. The response from DCS, however, was not what they had hoped for. There was no record of Hayden being removed from Dustin's care, nor was there any documentation indicating that the child had been placed back into foster care or under the care of another family member. In fact, DCS confirmed that Hayden had been under Dustin's care since he was returned to him in 2018, with no subsequent interventions or removals. This revelation immediately raised further suspicions. If Dustin had lied about Hayden being taken away, what else was he hiding? The more the investigators dug into his claims, the more inconsistencies they found. Dustin's statements, which had once been vague but seemingly harmless, now appeared to be part of a larger web of evasion. He had maintained that Hayden was fine, yet there was no evidence to support that claim. If anything, the lies seemed to point toward a much darker reality. The next step was to examine Dustin's whereabouts and living conditions more closely. As the investigation unfolded, law enforcement turned their attention to Dustin's former residences, including the house he had lived in with his girlfriend, Crystal Hall, and her children. This house, which was owned by Crystal's father, had been one of the places where Hayden was last known to have lived. Neighbors had reported seeing 2 girls, but had never seen Hayden outside the house. This raised the first red flag. If Hayden had been living there, why had no one seen him? With a warrant in hand, investigators searched the property, hoping to uncover any clues that might lead them to Hayden. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their trained noses sniffing every corner of the house and surrounding grounds. The search, however, yielded no immediate results. No physical evidence of Hayden, nor any signs of foul play, could be found. The house had been abandoned when Dustin and Crystal moved out of state in 2021, but the lack of evidence left investigators perplexed. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the renewed focus on Dustin's living situation led to new insights. Neighbors who had previously been reluctant to speak out began to provide additional details about Dustin's behavior. Some claimed that he had seemed nervous and agitated in the months leading up to Hayden's disappearance. Others mentioned that he had made odd statements about his family life, often talking about starting over or making a new family. These comments, combined with his refusal to engage with law enforcement or family, painted a troubling picture of a man who was either hiding something or trying to escape from his past. The breakthrough came when investigators uncovered new details about Dustin's movements during the critical period of Hayden's disappearance. A closer look at his communications revealed that, while he had been increasingly evasive with the family, he had been in contact with other people during this time. These communications were sparse and often cryptic, but they raised important questions about who Dustin had been speaking to, and whether they knew anything about Hayden's fate. One of the most significant discoveries came in November 2024, when Dustin was pulled over during a routine traffic stop. He appeared nervous, and officers noted his strange behavior during the stop. When questioned, Dustin mentioned that he had recently been asked by police about Hayden's whereabouts, which immediately raised suspicion. The tension of the moment seemed to get to him, as he was unable to provide any coherent explanation for Hayden's absence. During the stop, police also found heroin, methamphetamine, and a syringe in Dustin's car, leading to his immediate arrest on drug possession charges. Dustin's arrest provided the authorities with new leverage. They questioned him about Hayden, but he refused to cooperate. His silence only deepened the mystery. In the days following his arrest, Dustin's grandmother posted bond, and he was released. However, just days later, on December 15, 2024, Dustin was found dead from an overdose. The coroner's report indicated that the cause of death was acute mixed drug intoxication, a tragic end to a life that had been marred by addiction and instability. With Dustin's death, the investigation into Hayden's disappearance took another unexpected turn. Despite the fact that the primary person of interest in the case was no longer alive, the authorities remained determined to find answers. The case, now complicated by Dustin's death and the lack of concrete evidence, would require a new approach. Law enforcement continued to search for Hayden, combing through old records and revisiting potential leads. They focused on any possible clues that had been overlooked in the years since Hayden's disappearance. As the case continued to unfold, the investigators were forced to confront a painful truth. If Hayden had died during the time he was living with Dustin, it might be impossible to ever find his body. However, the investigation was far from over. There were still questions that needed answers, and the authorities remained resolute in their pursuit of justice for Hayden Mannis. The death of Dustin Mannis in December 2024 brought an unexpected turn to the investigation, leaving a trail of questions that would never be fully answered. While law enforcement had hoped to confront Dustin directly in order to uncover the truth behind Hayden's disappearance, his sudden overdose left them with only the silence of his death. In the wake of his passing, the investigation took on a new, somber tone. Despite Dustin's absence, the search for Hayden remained a priority for law enforcement. The authorities knew that without Dustin, they might never know the full story of what had happened to the young boy. But his silence, compounded by the fact that he was the last person to see Hayden, left a deep sense of frustration among investigators. Dustin had made no effort to ease the family's fears. He had not provided any answers, and now he could not speak for himself. One of the most painful aspects of this case was the lack of closure. Hayden's family, particularly his grandfather Gary, still clung to the hope that Hayden was alive, that he could somehow be found. But as the days turned into months, and the months turned into years, that hope began to fade. Gary, who had once been the most optimistic, now found himself haunted by the silence and the absence of answers. He would often remember Hayden's smile, the last time he saw him running around during that Christmas celebration. But the pain of not knowing what had happened to his beloved grandson was becoming unbearable. The absence of physical evidence, a body, a sign of foul play, anything that could provide a clue, left the case in limbo. It was as though Hayden had simply vanished, leaving behind a gaping hole in the lives of those who loved him. Investigators had scoured Dustin's homes, his properties, and even conducted searches using cadaver dogs, but each attempt to find a trace of Hayden had come up empty. In the absence of concrete evidence, the investigators began to explore new theories. Some suggested that Hayden might have been the victim of neglect or an accident while living with Dustin. The possibility that he could have wandered away, gotten lost, or met with some other tragic fate seemed more likely with each passing day. Still, no matter how plausible the theory, it did little to bring closure to a case that seemed destined to remain unresolved. As the investigation continued, the authorities revisited the timeline of events. The year 2020 had marked the start of a shift in the case's focus. The COVID-19 pandemic had changed many things, including the way law enforcement conducted investigations. The restrictions on travel, the limited ability to gather witnesses, and the overwhelming nature of the pandemic meant that many investigations were put on hold or faced delays. The fact that Hayden's case had been pushed to the back burner during this time was not lost on the family. In hindsight, they believed that the pandemic, combined with the lack of clear evidence, allowed the case to lose momentum and fade into obscurity. For the Manis family, each year that passed without answers only deepened their pain. The memory of Hayden, frozen in time from that last Christmas, remained their only link to him. They couldn't move on, couldn't let go of the hope that one day the truth would come to light. But the years continued to slip by, and each new lead led to more dead ends. Despite the growing sense of hopelessness, the family never gave up on Hayden. They continued to reach out to authorities, asking for updates, requesting that the case be kept active. Their persistence, fueled by the love they had for the child who had brought so much joy to their lives, kept the investigation from being completely forgotten. But the truth seemed as elusive as ever. The haunting question remained: what happened to Hayden? Was he alive? Was he dead? And if so, where was his body? Theories began to spread among the community, some more plausible than others. Some believed that Hayden might have been accidentally harmed by Dustin, perhaps during one of his erratic periods. Others speculated that Hayden might have wandered off or gotten into a dangerous situation. But there were no answers, and the absence of Hayden's body made it impossible for law enforcement to definitively close the case. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to consider the possibility of foul play, particularly as new details came to light. While there were no immediate signs of physical harm, the lack of evidence and Dustin's questionable behavior raised suspicions that the case could involve more than just neglect or an accident. The idea that Hayden might have met a violent end began to take shape, but without evidence, this theory could not be confirmed. By 2025, nearly 6 years after Hayden's disappearance, the investigation was still ongoing. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the authorities were not ready to give up on finding out what happened to the young boy. They remained committed to uncovering the truth, no matter how long it took. For the Manis family, the pain of not knowing what had happened to Hayden never went away. They clung to the hope that one day someone would come forward with information, or that the truth would finally be revealed. But as the investigation stretched into another year, that hope grew fainter. The case of Hayden Manis, once full of potential answers, had become a tragic reminder of how quickly a life could be lost without a trace. The family, devastated by the loss and the silence, continued to search for closure. But it remained elusive. Each passing day without answers was another day that Hayden's family had to endure without him. As 2025 continued to unfold, the case of Hayden Manis remained a source of constant turmoil for his family and the community. The investigation had brought no new answers, and the silence surrounding Hayden's disappearance had only deepened. What had once been a hopeful search for a missing child had evolved into a quiet, painful wait for closure. The family, who had held on to the belief that Hayden might one day return, now faced the grim reality that they may never have the full truth. In the absence of concrete evidence, the public's perception of the case began to evolve. As more time passed without any breakthroughs, theories about what happened to Hayden began to spread. Some speculated that Hayden had been the victim of an accident. Perhaps he had wandered away and gotten lost, or had been involved in an incident that Dustin couldn't explain. These theories, though somewhat comforting in their simplicity, did little to quell the growing sense of unease that surrounded the case. How could a 4-year-old child simply vanish without a trace, without anyone noticing. The more cynical theories began to take hold in the community. Some whispered that Dustin had harmed Hayden, either intentionally or through neglect. Given his history with addiction and his erratic behavior in the months leading up to Hayden's disappearance, the idea that Dustin could have been responsible for his son's death was not easily dismissed. But there was no hard evidence to support this theory, just the suspicion that Dustin's actions, his silence, his evasiveness, had something to do with it. As the investigation stalled, more people began to speculate about the possibility of foul play. If Hayden had been murdered, where was the body? Was he buried somewhere near Dustin's former residences? Or was he discarded elsewhere, hidden away to cover up the crime? These dark thoughts pervaded the case, as the idea that Dustin had somehow been involved in his son's death began to feel like the only plausible explanation. But without any physical evidence, these theories remained just that: speculation. The theory that Hayden had been trafficked also gained traction in some circles. While there was no direct evidence to suggest that he had been taken by human traffickers, the possibility lingered in the background. The lack of any sightings of Hayden after his disappearance, the inconsistencies in Dustin's story, and the apparent disappearance of the child from the public eye all contributed to this theory. But again, there was no concrete evidence to support it. The idea of trafficking seemed distant, almost impossible given the lack of witnesses or reports of any unusual activity in the area. It was a possibility, but a distant one, and one that could never be proven with the information at hand. As the theories continued to swirl, the family found themselves grappling with the ever-present question: what happened to Hayden? Theories were not answers, but they were all they had. The lack of any direct clues left them in a constant state of doubt, unsure of whether to hold on to the hope that Hayden was still alive or to confront the painful possibility that he might never come back. Despite the growing sense of despair, the family clung to the memory of Hayden that they held in their hearts. They would not give up on him, not entirely. Even though the investigation had hit a wall, they continued to search for answers. Gary, who had spent years waiting for some sign of Hayden, was resolute in his belief that his grandson was still out there. Though his optimism was slowly fading, the idea that Hayden might still be alive, somewhere, continued to give him hope. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was not ready to abandon the case either. The Delaware County prosecutor had promised to keep the case open, and the investigators continued to revisit old leads, hoping that something, anything, might surface to bring them closer to the truth. But as the years went on, the case grew colder, and the likelihood of finding Hayden alive seemed increasingly unlikely. In 2025, the case took another unexpected turn when a new witness came forward. The individual, a former acquaintance of Dustin's, claimed to have seen Hayden in a town several hundred miles away from Muncie in early 2020. This witness, who had previously been reluctant to come forward, now said they were certain they had seen a boy matching Hayden's description in the company of a man they believed to be Dustin. The witness, however, did not know the man's name and could not provide a clear explanation of what the situation had been. This new lead, while intriguing, was far from conclusive. The witness's statement was the only piece of information that suggested Hayden could still be alive, but it was not enough to verify the claim. The police began to investigate the lead, trying to trace Dustin's movements during the time in question, but it was yet another dead end, one more piece of the puzzle that seemed impossible to fit into place. For the family, this new lead only deepened the confusion. Was Hayden really still out there? If so, why hadn't he been found by now? And why had Dustin kept him hidden, if that was indeed what had happened? The questions kept piling up, and with each new piece of information, the family's desire for answers grew stronger. Despite the uncertainties and the lack of hard evidence, the investigation remained open, fueled by the determination of the authorities and the persistence of Hayden's family. The truth, however elusive, was still out there. But after nearly 6 years, it remained just out of reach. In 2025, a new development added a brief flicker of hope. A witness, who had previously been reluctant to come forward, reported seeing a child resembling Hayden in a nearby town in 2020, shortly after his disappearance. The witness had seen the child with a man who was believed to be Dustin, though no other details were available. This potential sighting, although intriguing, was not enough to confirm anything. It added another layer of mystery, suggesting that Hayden might still be alive, but the lack of any other corroborating evidence meant the lead quickly fizzled out. With no body, no new evidence, and Dustin's death preventing any direct confrontation with the primary suspect, the family found themselves in a painful limbo. They had spent nearly 6 years in this state of uncertainty, but they refused to give up entirely. The family held on to the hope that Hayden might still be out there somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia, or that new information would one day lead to his discovery. Gary continued to remember the last time he saw Hayden, full of life, playing with his family. But the weight of the years was starting to take a toll. For law enforcement, the case had become one of the many unsolved mysteries they had to contend with. Despite the emotional involvement of the officers, who had seen firsthand how deeply the family had been affected, the investigation seemed to be stuck in a cycle of dead ends. Each potential lead was either exhausted or proved to be inconclusive. However, despite the exhaustion, both the police and the family remained committed to finding the truth. In the face of these ongoing frustrations, the family clung to one thing: their love for Hayden. They held on to the memories of the child they had known, the boy who had once brought so much joy to their lives. For them, the idea of him being alive, somewhere out there, was still worth pursuing, no matter how slim the chance. They continued to reach out to anyone who might have information, still holding on to the belief that one day someone would come forward with the answers they so desperately needed. Despite the bleak reality, the search continued. The question remained: what happened to Hayden Manis? The family, though growing weary, knew they had to keep searching for answers, if only for Hayden's memory. The hope of closure, whether through the discovery of Hayden or at least understanding what had happened to him, continued to drive them forward, even as the years stretched on. As the search for Hayden continues, the unanswered questions still linger, casting a shadow over those who loved him. The journey for closure may seem endless, but with every piece of new information, the possibility of bringing Hayden home remains. No matter how long it takes, the truth is out there, somewhere in the silence, somewhere in the memories, and somewhere in the hope that one day the story of Hayden Manis will find its end. If you found this story compelling, please like, share, and comment below. Your voice could help keep the search for Hayden alive. Don't forget to subscribe for more updates and to stay informed about the case. Every bit of attention and support could bring us closer to the truth.